Some economists are now talking about the fact that our jobs and lives will be changed forever after the pandemic. And among them, Harvard's Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart. It's on the Bloomberg. It's a great article, and I encourage everyone to go and check it out. Here were some of the longer-term implications that both spoke of. Rogoff was saying we're going to have experienced an extremely negative productivity shock with de-globalization, and Reinhart saying that some of the scars are on supply chains we don't think will return to their pre-crisis normal, will be more inward-looking. Let's get a third perspective. Joining me now, Joseph Stiglitz, Columbia University professor of economics and Nobel Prize winning economist. Professor, I'm thrilled to chat with you. What do you think? Rogoff and Reinhart weighed in.
They're correct. There are some more elements. In the short run, there are going to be major structural changes in demand. Some of this is obvious. We'll be using more Zoom, the remote, less airlines. There's going to be very big effects on balance sheets. Many of the firms are going to have a high debt overhang. Even if they survive the pandemic, they're going to be more in debt, and debt does affect behavior in a multiplicity of ways. At least in the short to medium term, there's going to be a lot of precautionary behavior, which means investment and consumption are likely to be dampened. So I think that when asked, there will be these major structural changes, supply side changes, and at least to the short, medium term, a very big demand problem.
So let's tackle the supply chain, actually short and long term. The conversation has really been about how we're going to make it closer to home and a just-in-case inventory situation. And then there was a poll out by FTI Consulting that said a large portion of Americans don't want to buy goods made in China and would be willing to actually pay more for goods that don't come to China. Can you walk me through what you think the results of this will be coming out?
Well, first, a lot of that doesn't fully take into account the interdependence of our economies. When you buy something like an Apple, an iPhone, or whether it's assembled in China or not, it has lots of parts from lots of different countries. And you can't really take it apart to figure out what comes from where. Many of our medicines come from China. They're not packaged, they're not sold as Chinese medicines, but some of the key ingredients do. So separating the two is going to be very, very difficult. Some people are hoping that onshoring process that you described will bring back jobs to the United States. But I think that's a fallacy as well. I think as jobs get brought back, and I think there will be undoubtedly a lot of that going on as we realized we had constructed a supply chain that was not resilient. We were, the corporate sector, not surprisingly, was in a very short-sighted perspective, saving a dime here and a dime there, but not looking at the long run, the risks we face. But when they bring it back, it's going to be more with robots in manufacturing, not with the labor that's been displaced in the Midwest and the South. So it's going to be continuing the process of deindustrialization. It's not going to be a reversal of that process.
Well, that's a really interesting take. So I wonder then what that winds up meaning on a company level. I mean, is that many talk about how we're in the point of structurally lower margins. Do you not see that as being true if this really moves the shift into, say, robots and AI?
Well, the issue on margins, I think of as more related to the problem of competition. And that's a problem that has been deep-seated in our economy for for a couple of decades. In my recent book, People, Power, and Profits, I focused on the increase in market power, monopoly power, that in sector after sector of our economy, there is very limited competition. And of course, taking competition out from Chinese companies is going to exacerbate the market power of the firms that remain. So what I worry about is quite the opposite, that as we onshore, as we focus more on domestic production, the behemoths within the United States are going to have more market power, and there's actually margins for the ones who survive are going to be greater. Now, of course, part of the structural change we're seeing is that right now companies that were at the edge have gone over the edge, the bricks and mortar retail stores. So there will be some sectors that obviously are going to be suffering a great deal. And but by the way, those in that sector who survive, again, competition will be less than expand. So we'll have a less vibrant economy probably emerging from this crisis.
And we'll get to the bankruptcy point that you make, which is an important one in just a second. But I want to focus on those companies that survive and do well, sort of what they look like. What does that mean for the workforce? I mean, how do we then employ people? Are we going to have to look to the government for like a massive public works program to keep people employed?
Well, if we stimulate economic demand enough, then of course the market will create the jobs. But I don't also want to emphasize that we are going through a structural change to a service sector economy in which a number of the key service sectors are sectors where we naturally turn to the government. The healthcare sector, the education sector, caring for the aged. And in fact, the crisis has exposed the importance of one sector that has gotten very little money, our research in our university sector, our higher education. These are all sectors that necessarily need a lot of government support. So what worries me is that there won't be enough government support. People will say, well, we spent so much money to save the airlines, to save the old economy. We don't have enough money to shape the kind of economy that we should have going forward.
So what does that mean then for the unemployment rate and for growth? If you were to model out a little bit, what do we see like today, but what do we see like in 12, 18, 24 months?
Well, I'm quite frankly rather pessimistic. The uncertainty associated with the pandemic is not likely to go away. We could be very lucky. We could get the vaccine very quickly. It could go into mass production. That is a possibility, but it's one that I put at the low probability, and I think most of the experts share that. And as long as there is this kind of uncertainty hanging over us, that combined with the devastation to the balance sheets of so many households and firms is going to mean that aggregate demand is going to remain low unless we have adequate government support. So the only way for this in the next 24 months or so is adequate government support. The chairman of the Federal Reserve has said as much. What worries me is that many people in the Republican Party have said, go slow. They've not wanted to support the state and local governments. The state and local governments' tax revenues fell in 2008 at twice the rate of the GDP. And that means, because they have balanced budget frameworks, they have to cut employment and expenditures. That by itself, if we don't provide that money, we will be with a weak labor market and in a recession.
So is that like, what is that? Is that negative growth for how long? Is that an unemployment rate of 30%? Like, what is that?
Well, we are going towards an unemployment rate of at least 25%. And, you know, there are different measures of unemployment. Officially, there's something called U6, which is a more comprehensive measure, which includes those who've given up looking for jobs because there aren't any. It includes those who are working part-time involuntarily because there aren't full-time jobs. That broader measure almost surely is in the range of 25% or even higher today. So we have a very weak labor market. And unless there is more government support, better targeted, then that is likely to continue, maybe a little abated, but we won't be back anywhere near into what we would normally say is a terrible level of, say, 10%, 12%. Let me put it another way. We spent almost $3 trillion. It was a badly designed program. Other countries spent a fraction of what we spent and avoided the increase in unemployment because we had the most poorly designed program. Quite frankly, the Democrats tried, but there was a political battle at play.
So, Professor, you've also talked a lot about Argentina, and we have the debt deadline coming on Friday. And one viewer wrote in and asked you, you support the debt restructuring deal that Martin Guzman has laid out, the economy minister. Do you think that a deal with creditors is really possible right now?
Oh, absolutely. A deal is possible. The question is fundamentally whether the creditors act, I would say, even in their own interest. Any deal has to be sustainable. It doesn't do anybody good to make an agreement which in 5 years' time isn't able to be fulfilled. And the history of credit restructuring is that half the time, within 5 years, they're back with another default. Argentina says, we don't want to do this again. And that's really what the debate is about. And I think it's in the interest of the creditors to make an agreement because, with the pandemic, Argentina is just the first in line. There's already been a debt default in Lebanon, but there are many countries coming up. And Argentina hopefully will be a model of how this can be done with goodwill, with both sides walking off saying, we wish this hadn't been, but we have to live with reality, not with a fictional world that we had hoped to be.